country was in quite enough of a mess already. It was absolutely daft to unintentionally put into office a government which would be even worse. You didn't even have to do it. People seem to think that once the opinion polls are switched and say this is what's going to happen in the election, they therefore then have to switch off any kind of independent thinking capacity they have and do what the opinion polls tell them to do. It's crazy. But this government was completely avoidable by human will.
Let's start with reform.
Well, they're a Thatcherite tribute band.
Peter, we were just talking off camera about the future of the right, and you chuckled there.
Well, it reminded me of a book published by one Michael Gove some years ago called Michael Portillo, The Future of the Right. And it contains so many laughable things in it that it's hard to recall that it existed. But the phrase "the future of the right" always conjures up that memory of mine.
So, I mean, let's start.
The future of the right is making programs about railway trains.
Right, good point. So, let's start with reform.
Let's start with reform.
Your take on reform, because I found a quote you describing UKIP as a cravat-wearing dad's army party.
I think they were.
Are reform any different?
Well, they're a Thatcherite tribute band. They are a Margaret Thatcher tribute band. That's what they are. They're trying to get out of it. Basically, they haven't got any ideas apart from let's go back to the piping days of Margaret Thatcher, which weren't actually that good. And there's no real profound thought in it or understanding. Anybody who sets out, for instance, to cut public spending has to understand why it's so high. And it is so high because we had a cultural and moral revolution in which we tried to replace the family with the state. It's incredibly expensive doing that. And that's why reform has run into such trouble with county councils so quickly. They're very rapidly discover that much as they might want to cut spending, they're obliged to spend huge amounts of money. They're going to have to raise council tax, as I understand it. The same problem will arise with national government. Unless you have seriously conservative policies which involve turning back the clock, as some people would put it, or simply putting things back to the way they ought to be, as I would put it, then you won't be able to do that. So you won't have any economic policy if you haven't got an actual moral and social policy. So, or an educational one, come to that.
Yeah.
Same with migration. I mean, if I just do this, if we had still had a proper education system which prepared people, amongst other things, for work.
You're talking about grammar schools as well?
Well, grammar schools are part of it.
Yeah.
Actually, the secondary modern schools were better than the comprehensives as well. We abolished quite a large number of effective schools and replaced them with a lot of ineffective schools. And whichever way you look at it, but which is an amazing thing to do, to actually destroy good things in the completely theoretical hope that what will replace them will be better. But what we actually did was we created an awful lot of people who employers don't want to employ and they would prefer, and who can blame them under the circumstances, they would prefer to employ people who were educated somewhere else.
I mean, I'd like to drill into the specifics on what you consider conservative policies, but I think a broader question, which I know you've been asked before, what is a conservative to you, Peter Hitchens?
Well, someone who doesn't make unnecessary changes, who takes the old-fashioned Burkean view that it's not necessary to change, it's necessary not to change, but also somebody who has a pretty good idea of what is the good and tries to preserve it as much as possible. An awful lot of the job of people who inherit is to preserve what they inherit and pass it on to the next generation. And that's what Conservatives are above all supposed to do. Not too many bright ideas, thank you so much.
When you say wind things back to how...
Well, that's how other people would put it.
Well,
I would say that there is actually a type of society which in this country has in the past been very successful, in which the state does not interfere too much with people, but nonetheless protects them against disaster, in which the family is encouraged as a very, very major part of society, and the pillar of private life, which is badly needed in any free country. And you start from there and you work out, you also have to have strong defense against real enemies so that the country is secure. It's secure from whoever might realistically threaten it from abroad. And it's also secure internally from people who threaten the peace and safety of the individual. And in neither of those things are we successful at the moment, because as in so many other areas, we're bound up in a sort of utopian idea of what we ought to be rather than a realistic idea of what we can be.
Yeah, so where did this start in your view? Is it not just with the Blairite project. But
good
before
Lord,
that,
no.
there was Thatcher.
It's a quarter of a century since I wrote a book called The Abolition of Britain, which I went through some of the trends, which a lot of people think it's a completely different book from what it is. They think it's some kind of enraged bloviation. It's actually an analysis of several movements which brought about profound change, deliberately I say, brought about profound change in Britain and other Western societies, and how they did it. And I believe, and have believed since I wrote the book, is when I set out to write it all, can there be, as an ex-Marxist, the idea appealed to me a bit, can there be a single cause for all this? And there isn't. The only cause of it was a negative one, which was the general collapse, particularly of Christianity, but also of a lot of things which went with the type of Protestant Christianity which prevailed in this country. And that died really after the First World War. And things rushed in to replace it when it fell. And that's why we live. But we've had enough experience now, it seems to me, to realize that there's an awful lot of the things we did in that era were a mistake. Some of them were good, but many of them were not, and many of them did lasting harm. And if you were serious about being conservative, you'd say, well, all right, yes, the moment does sometimes come to put things back, to restore, to build up what has been broken down, and to restore what has been torn away.
Yeah. Are there any figures on the political right in this country which are saying at least the right things in this space, you think?
No, not really.
Yeah.
I have a soft spot for Jacob Rees-Mogg because I think he gets it, and also because his fundamental driving force is a Christian one, and therefore he understands that must be the starting point. I do believe that a belief in God is a very important starting point for any kind of Christian perspective. Otherwise, why should you do the sort of things that I urge, which involve a great deal of self-restraint and the recultivation of conscience, which is actually all about self-restraint and not doing things? Why would you do that if we just lived for the moment? If at the end of our lives nothing that we did had any significance?
Yeah, we had Jacob sitting in that chair just over a month ago, and just to return to specific policy ideas as well, drill down into that stuff. He's very much in favour of cutting entire Whitehall departments, slashing spending massively.
This is because he spent so much time with the Conservative Party.
This is
the wrong end.
Right.
You say, we will cut taxes. Well, you won't cut taxes unless you cut spending. We will cut spending. Well, you won't cut spending unless you cut the reasons for the spending in the first place. And that's the point at which most of them stop thinking. And there are a number of things about Jacob. First of all, he is in the Conservative Party, isn't he, I think?
He still is, yeah.
And people drift about these days. And therefore that has infected him with what seems to me to be the very narrow perspective of that party and the very narrow area in which it's prepared to think. And the other thing, of course, is that it almost compels people to admire Margaret Thatcher, who wasn't, in my view, a conservative at all, but was an economic liberal, who, although in her personal life and opinions was conservative, did nothing as a head of government or as a minister to restore or increase conservative things.
Yeah, and so you think her influence on the contemporary party is still very strong, and therefore that's a negative force.
I think the current leader went around for some time pretty much dressed as her. And there was this ridiculous thing at the Conservative conference where they actually had a kind of museum of Thatcher clothing.
Yeah, they did. I saw that. And a mosaic, yeah.
Embarrassing. And then, of course, Jacob suffers from his insistence on wearing double-breasted pajamas and to put him outside. It's really serious consideration in politics.
Okay, so the Conservative Party.
I applaud the sense of humour, but I just think it's not likely to lead to the steps of Number 10 Downing Street. Though maybe if he knows enough about conservatism, he possibly doesn't want to go there anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so he's talking about uniting the right. Now, again, you would disagree this thing even exists, right? But for the sake of
find it,
yeah, right. If you try and find it, but for the sake of
two things I can't find: the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. I've hunted for it for years, and it's not there. And the other thing is the right.
The right, okay. But for argument's sake, what everyone else in the village calls the right, the Conservatives and Reform, they unite, and therefore that's the most effective way to defeat Labour. Now,
defeat Labour?
Well, but that's interesting because you said last year, right, vote for anyone else but Labour,
Well, that's because it seemed to me to be absolutely daft. The country was in quite enough of a mess already. It was absolutely daft to unintentionally, as many of the people who did this did, unintentionally put into office a government which would be even worse. We didn't even have to do it. And people seem to think that once the opinion polls are switched and say this is what's going to happen in the election, they therefore then have to switch off any kind of independent thinking capacity they have and do what the opinion polls tell them to do. It's crazy. But this government was completely avoidable by human will. And I spent weeks saying to people, all you need to do is vote against them. It doesn't, you want to be voted. I don't care who it is you vote for. Voting for is a waste of time for any grown-up anyway. Just vote against Labour if you're in a constituency where your vote could prevent them getting in. And that was all I did. And people wouldn't do it. So now they moan all the time about this terrible Starmer government, which they can't stand. And I said, well, you put it there.
Yeah. So do you think they're doing worse than you predicted, or is this basically, are they following the path you predicted?
In a different way. I think it's more incompetent than I imagined it could possibly be at the start. And I really didn't think. I had a sort of respect for the professionalism of the Blairites, but they seem to have lost a lot of that. I think they've been overtaken as governments often are by economic circumstances more quickly than they thought. I think there are fundamentals in their policy and in their minds, particularly constitutional ones, which are still very serious, and if they have the chance to do them, will come our way. And I think the sudden revival of identity cards is a sign of that. These people are not very concerned about the freedom of the individual.
And so their argument is, of course, that it's to crack down on immigration.
But this is so plainly a pretext rather than an argument. It takes a moment's examination to see it will do no such thing, that you must realise that obviously that isn't it.
And it can be compromised. And I mean, you wrote about this. I was reading on the Mail on Sunday.
Incessantly, but it's quite simple. It overturns the proper relationship between the state and the individual. The state should answer to you, not you to the state.
Do you think... So when you argued last year that this might be a government that creates what policy the last 10, 20 years, or have a massive damaging legacy, is it now slightly changed by the fact that, okay, you have your serious reservations about reform, but they are now more popular than perhaps was obvious a year ago? And so the calculation is slightly different?
I don't know how well that's going to work. I mean, the thing is that reform has sort of peaked, hasn't it?
I don't know. Do you think so?
Everything that's going to happen to them now is going to be people paying more and more attention to who and what they actually are. It takes quite a long time to build a political party basically out of nothing. The last time there was nearly a big transformation in British politics, the SGP Liberal Alliance, the leaders of it were experienced politicians who knew how to play the game. Farage is a great showman, but he's not an experienced politician. And while he knows how to play certain games, it's very hard to envisage him in power. And also it's quite hard to envisage what he would actually do if he were in power. I think probably he's afraid of power now. He sees it coming quite close. It probably makes him rather nervous. What is he going to do with it? Who are his lieutenants going to be? Who will he be able to rely on? And it's not... Therefore, there's this long period during which I think reform can fray at the edges rather than strengthen.
Do you think the Conservative Party is dead now, or is if a Robert Jenrick or whoever comes along, presumably you think Kevin Badenoch is going to bury the party?
I don't. It's as I say, I believe so strongly in voting against. I also believe that parties benefit from their opponents being unpopular rather than from being popular. The current government is growing more unpopular all the time. If the economy takes, as I think it may well do in the next couple of years, a very serious dive, then that unpopularity could become terminal, in which case an extraordinary miracle could befall the Conservative Party. So never say never. In 2014, I would have begged people to destroy the Conservative Party. It was the most vital thing to do to prevent what was a Blairite putsch in that party, to take it over for the forces of Eurocommunism, but nobody would pay any attention at all. I even took other right-wing columnists out to lunch. I said, please, I just don't want to be the only person saying this. There are people now in the commentary business on the right who at the time supported the Tories, spent the past 2 years saying how terrible they were. which is what I was telling him in 2014.
But it's interesting because that
now it's different.
Yeah.
You do not step into the same political river twice. Now we have completely different circumstances in which I can't anymore say that the best thing that could possibly happen would be the disappearance of the Tory party. But on the other hand, I can't make any impact on it. Nobody ever pays any attention to anything I say, as I can witness.
Well, look, maybe they were. They just took a while to absorb it. And now it's too...
Political, tactical ideas such as destroying the Conservative Party are of their time. It would have been a fantastic idea to destroy the Conservative Party in 2014. Gordon Brown was actually well to the right of David Cameron. We would have had a more right-wing government from 2009. 2009 is the date.
Yeah.
I'm slipping. My mind's going.
That's all right. 2010 election. Yeah.
2009 was the year in which it had happened. And if Cameron had failed totally as he should have done, then Gordon Brown would remain in office. And I say he was particularly on the European single currency, and I think in his personal attitudes towards social matters, considerably to the right of Cameron. So it wouldn't really be much of a blow to thoughtful Conservatives to have him instead of Cameron. Cameron was the new Blair. It was fascinating the way that the big donors were leaving Blair and going to Cameron in 2009.
But it's interesting because I understand there's different circumstances, but if the Tories had been destroyed in 2010, that would have surely necessarily meant that a new party would have to be created.
It would, yes.
But that was a necessary risk at the time, you think?
What I always said was that provided an opportunity.
Right.
That the conservative people in the country, of whom there were then many more, and they had much more of a hold on institutions and in general in public life in 2009, 2010 than they do now, would have realised beyond that they had no friends at Westminster. And if they wanted to have any friends at Westminster, they would have to create a new political party which would give them friends at Westminster, which would be properly conservative and would stop making these compromises. The problem with conservatism and political conservatism in Britain for the previous 30 years is that it had been confronted with the party with a strong, well-argued, carefully thought-out dogma. And instead of confronting and examining that dogma, criticizing it and working out what was wrong with it and how to overturn it, they'd fallen in with it, which is what happens to any party which doesn't seriously oppose. It becomes what it beholds. And the Conservative Party had become the Labour Party.
And when you look across the pond at America and you see what's happening there, what do you make of that?
Different. We'd need another discussion for that. But American conservatism, being not particularly monarchist and certainly not Anglican in its origins, is wholly different from ours anyway. But the problems are disturbingly and misleadingly similar, but they're not the same.
Yeah. Because you mentioned the special relationship or lack thereof. Again, another...
There isn't one.
Right, okay.
It just isn't there.
But has that been borne out slightly more in the last year or so with the tariffs and the back and forth and the yo-yoing from the Trump administration?
People still seem to think that because when he goes to the White House, he isn't actually dumped immediately on the back doorstep and kicked down the street, that Keir Starmer is better for being in the good books of the American president. But I don't care. It doesn't matter at all to me if an American president admires or doesn't admire or is nice to or is not nice to a British Prime Minister. We're two separate countries with different interests, and we shouldn't suck up to them. We'll never get anything in return. When I was in Washington as a resident correspondent in the middle 90s, I watched the Clinton administration absolutely trample on this country's interests over the Irish issue, and it was extraordinary to watch the ruthlessness with which they did it. They couldn't have cared less that we were the British who were supposed to be their great shoulder-to-shoulder friends. Not even slightly. It's complete fantasy.
Yeah. I just find the whole thing so interesting because, every time Keir Starmer steps out and talks about the special relationship and lots of nodding heads, it's fake.
It's very strange. The Americans are puzzled by it, but they pander to it. If an American Prime Minister comes to Washington, the president is always told when they can get hold of him before the brief meeting, "You've got to mention the special relationship." "I've got to mention what?" says the president. "The special relationship." "What special?" "Just say it, Mr. President. Just mention it. That's all you need to do, and they'll be happy."
Yeah, well, I've seen it happen.
That's what it amounts to.
I've seen it happen. I mean, to be honest, talking about the sort of lobby groupthink and all that, then how political journalists are sort of ricocheted by this sort of stuff. So when you joined the lobby it was in the 80s.
Well, about 1880, I think.
Right.
Yeah, it was.
But I've read how you were disillusioned by it very quickly.
To continue listening to this interview, become a member now by heading over to order-order.com.